When I say the Holocaust, what do you think about?
When I was signing up for classes for spring semester, I got an email and it was saying that this new documentary class was being offered. It had never been a class before, and I was very excited to kind of reach out and see about taking the class.
Going in, I was thinking, we'll do learning how to do a documentary, and I know some people in the class like, let's do a mini documentary. Probably have a more feature story. That's just kind of the topics I'm more into, just the personal stories, the day by day, different people's lives, and then just kind of fun stuff. And the first day we sat down, and she was like, when I say the Holocaust, what do you guys think about?
And it was pretty intimidating when we first heard that it was right about the Holocaust. How do we cover such a serious, dramatic topic with only 15 weeks to research and prepare? But as the semester kind of progressed on, we realized that intimidation was kind of morphing into more hope, and we figured out what we were doing.
We were on a tight deadline. We immediately started going out and shooting B-roll. We started brainstorming, what kinds of interviews can we get to discuss this topic? Who can we find to tell these stories? And we started doing a lot of research.
There's a theory that states every 80 years, history repeats itself. The Strauss-Howe generation theory explains how every 4 generations, social order is changed and a new one is created. Baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and now Gen Z. What does this tell us? According to Strauss-Howe, we're heading to the end of the 80-year cycle.
Rise in targeted attacks.
An all-time high for hate crimes.
Surge of racist attacks. The number of anti-Semitic hate crimes has doubled.
The FBI says more than 7,000 criminal incidents of the 51 hate-motivated killings reported last year.
Highest level in more than a decade.
After their defeat in World War I, German political leaders signed the Treaty of Versailles. This stripped them of their military and their land and forced them to take full responsibility for the conflict. In addition to the loss of millions of lives and the cost of injuries on the battlefield, Germans had to pay reparations of more than 132 billion gold marks, the equivalent to 33 billion US dollars in 1918. The Reichsbank issued the first 100 trillion mark note in November of 1923. $1 US was worth 4.2 million marks by the end of the month. Paper notes became worthless. That is known as hyperinflation.
When the price of goods rises rapidly in a nation and the value of its currency falls simultaneously, it leads to numerous ramifications. Among many, this is panic among civilians, disorder, hunger, famine, and in some cases, revolution.
The newly formed Weimar Republic in Germany strove to curtail the pressures placed on the country. Through a series of diplomatic appeals and American loans through the Dawes Plan, Germany experienced some limited economic and political stability from 1923 to 1929. But then the Great Depression hit. The U.S. called back its loans. The golden age of the Weimar Republic ended as financial instability and unemployment sparked looming government distrust. This left Germans desperate and vulnerable to the propaganda spread by the once small revolutionary Nazi Party. There was a desire to return to a time of stability and power, a need for someone to blame. Scholars have found the voting behavior that led to Hitler's ascent to power in 1933 was not out of the ordinary, even though the consequences were.
It's hard to really wrap your head around what it might have been like for anyone living during that time. I've never come close to ever experiencing any kind of, war-torn living situation or just feeling absolute fear every single day. And so when we were told that we were going to be speaking to Elizabeth Hunt Appleby, who lived during that time as a German, it was really exciting to get to hear someone's personal experience and kind of get to sit in front of her and hear her stories rather than, just looking at pictures in a history textbook.
Wait a minute, you're getting there.
yeah. That's when I came to, and there was a parade or something. The Easter parade.
Elizabeth Hunt Appleby was born on June 20th, 1934. Her small village of Hochheis, Germany, the highest town in the Harz Mountains, was geographically isolated from the rest of Europe. Farmers by trade, the Hunt family quietly resisted Nazi rise to power. Arthur Hunt was more concerned with feeding his 4 young children. He was the only man who chose to go to work instead of waving a Nazi party flag with the other families in town.
The convoy of vehicles came up the highway and they stopped. And my grandfather knew immediately who the guy in the front was. It was Adolf Hitler.
What initially started out as an act of defiance quickly turned into fear.
He got out of the car and he went straight to my mom and he bent over and he pinched her on the cheek and he was just so thrilled. And he went to the media that was there. He goes, "This is a perfect example of a man working for the fatherland." And my grandfather went from being scared to death. Now he's pissed off again because now he's being used as a propaganda tool.
Propaganda, the most powerful weapon of the Nazi Party. Used to identify and dehumanize social, religious, and ethnic groups not deemed compatible with Hitler's version of superior race. It encouraged their punishment, imprisonment, and extermination. And Germany's prisoners of war were met with the same fate.
Where Hitler pinched my cheeks, right across from our field, there was a Russian prison camp.
It was a German prisoner of war camp filled with captured Russian soldiers. Germany invaded Russia on June 22, 1941. It was their intention to expand their control over the land and remove or exterminate any undesired peoples. Captured soldiers and civilians were killed, enslaved, starved, or worked to death. Second only to the Jews, Soviet prisoners were the largest group of victims of the Nazi racial policy. Even in the midst of torture and death, there still existed some small moments of compassion.
Well, there was a big wire fence around it and everything, my brothers and I, and they had the root cellar on the bottom, and they were so hungry. And we kids went down there and stole the carrots and the potatoes and pushed what we could push through the fence and gave it to the Russians. They had their own little heating element they could eat.
So with the Hunt family in their kind of small town of Hochheis, it was isolated, and also having a Russian POW camp nearby was just kind of one of the closest things of Hunt's family realizing potentially the larger atrocities occurring.
And we were strictly ordered not to get too friendly with them. They could not eat at the table with us. And my mother said, "Well, I'm not going to do that. He sits with us at the table and eats like we eat. He's a human being."
This wasn't the only time Elizabeth's mother defied Nazi power. German citizens were required to fly the Nazi flag from their homes for Hitler's birthday. The people were required to buy the flags themselves.
And you had to use your ration card. You just have to figure everything was rationed. From the food, the only thing you could get free was salt. You couldn't get even a pair of shoestrings, you couldn't get that.
Elizabeth's mother's resourcefulness and stubbornness were her way of acting in defiance, fulfilling only the minimum requirements enforced by the SS.
And we had to use our clothing stamps to buy a flag. And my mother said, "I'm not going to spend the clothing stamps to buy buy a Hitler flag." That wasn't in the picture at all. And anyway, she found a little piece of red material, and I mentioned that before, and a piece of white sheet, a circle, and she put the swastika on it upside down, and it was a flag about the size of a good-sized hand towel. And everybody had these flowing flags going down to the second floor. And naturally we kids, we looked and he says, "Oh, we really have a terrible flag." We were kind of embarrassed about it.
Surely she knew the right way to put it on. They were constantly surrounded by swastikas. They were constantly surrounded by all of the Nazi imagery. The fact that she put it on upside down is just such a subtle means to reject the Nazism.
And everybody knew that my parents were no Nazis, but they couldn't catch them. You know what I mean? They always walked the line and they couldn't catch them.
the Hunts were the target of Nazi officials in town.
There was always somebody in front of our house waited for us to make a mistake.
Those infractions could be as small as leaving an oil lamp burning in the night or listening to restricted radio stations. Other times, Elizabeth's mother found herself face to face with opposition, as she did one night while in a pub.
And they went there, my father and my mother, and they were sitting, and my father had a beer, or if my mother had a beer, I don't know. And there was a meeting with the brown shirts, with the SS. They were so drunk, and they were singing, they all got up, and they're singing the Hitler song, and they had their arm up, in honoring Hitler. And my father got scared, and he wanted to get up, and my mother said, "No, you're not getting up." She pulled him down, and they kept on sitting there, and they were the only ones sitting in that place and wouldn't get up. And then the big shot came and says, if they didn't have the decency to get up and honor Hitler. And my mother said, I don't think that Hitler would like to know that you are in this drunken stupor here and honor him. That's not very nice to honor him. And they shut up and sat down.
This is yet another time when the Hunt family resisted the Nazi power. And they did so in a way that allowed them to grasp their own power. Because you have to realize these people who were living in Germany had no power. They didn't have freedom to resist the Nazis. That meant concentration camp, that meant labor camp, that meant death and torture. But we still see instances where good people are resisting, good people are taking back their power by being the only people in this pub sitting down. Literally everyone else around them is having a good time singing Hitler music. Elizabeth's father was scared. He wanted to join in, but his wife said, "No, you're going to sit back down. We aren't going to be doing this."
One of the hardest things about processing Hunt's stories is just considering her childhood perspective. You look back at this pivotal, intense moment in history, and there were times when I heard her stories and I thought, why, just with the powerlessness, why couldn't you do more? Why shouldn't you do more? And she was a kid. She was just a kid living this time, and it was just hard. And I think it's not our responsibility, it's not our kids' responsibility to try to make change in the world. And then with time, it's no longer our parents or the generations before. It is our time in the now to try to make the changes that we see around us that we need to make a change.
The Hunt stories illustrated a family's resistance against the overwhelming power of the Nazi regime. Their goal was to protect their loved ones, to pick their battles, to survive. But what happens when a child wants to protect his family?
The children have a very different vision of the world and so on. For me, the Germans were monsters. For me, if I had a sword and a metal armor, I would go and I would slaughter all the Germans.
Samuel Bach is a renowned painter and author. He created thousands of pieces inspired by his experiences surviving the Holocaust. He was born on August 12, 1933, in Vilnius, Lithuania, also referred to as Vilna. It's a region that would fall under the influence of various powers following World War I and into World War II.
I was born the year that Hitler came to power in Germany, 1933, which means 90 years ago.
Samuel's parents provided what he calls a child's paradise during the first 6 years of his life, protecting him from the threat of a new social order under the Third Reich. His father was a dentist, and his mother was a key teacher in his childhood. But Bach says he quickly learned the consequences of war.
House, I thought war was the most wonderful thing, but my amazement and my appreciation of war very soon faded. The German army arrived, we were thrown into the ghetto. To make it short, the Lithuanian Jewish community was slaughtered in a way that was absolutely unbelievable.
Roughly 15,000 Jewish refugees fleeing German-occupied Poland made their way to Soviet-controlled Vilna following the German-Soviet Pact in 1939. Then Germany attacked the Soviet Union in 1941. The German army occupied Vilna the third day after the invasion. In 1941, 8-year-old Samuel and his mother were forced to move to the Vilna ghetto with other Jewish families. With quick thinking, Samuel's mother escaped with her son and found refuge in a Benedictine convent. When the convent became compromised, however, Samuel's family had to return to the ghetto for safety. In 1943, Samuel was loaded onto a wood-burning truck and hauled to a labor camp known as HKP. There, his family would be reunited, before they were forever torn apart.
One of the most powerful examples was Bach's own story of survival at HKP, the labor camp he was at when he was a child. One of the most horrific stories came from one day German soldiers came to the camp claiming that they were there to give the children vaccinations, and so all mothers and fathers gathered up their kids to get these vaccinations. And as they were being lined up to get sent down, a family friend, Bach's parents, grabbed Bach's mother and pulled Bach and her aside to hide Bach away because they suspected something, and the suspicions were correct because it turned out that the German soldiers were there to kill all the kids. And just saying that is still just kind of hard to process. Family members were, put in shock. Bach in his book mentions hearing the screams and the cries and just the parents not knowing what to do. And it's just one of those stories where it's just very hard to process and realize that happened. But it was also, again, a period of strength and hope, and with that atrocity, the Bach's parents got put into action. After it occurred, Bach's father was like, okay, let's get my wife and my son out of here. So following that very chaotic event, the opportunity where they were able to sneak Bach's mom out through disguise and also some bribery, she was able to escape. And then Bach was later able to be snuck out through being put into a bag full of lumber that his dad carried him out of the camp. And that was the last time Bach saw his dad before Bach's father was shot and killed by German soldiers.
Samuel and his mother survived the remaining days of the war, hiding out with his Catholic aunt. In 1944, Samuel's father was murdered on the eve of the Red Army's recapture of Vilna. Samuel describes the Holocaust as a complex time in history.
The Holocaust, it's not only a terrible tragedy of the Jewish people, where 6 million of Jews were slaughtered. It is also a period which is almost like a laboratory of human behavior, where the worst and the best could come out from each individual.
HKP was run by Major Karl Plagge. The Jews enslaved in this labor camp worked on repairing trucks for the German war effort.
And he started to appreciate the people who were coming to work there, repairing cars. Some of them were musicians, some of them were doctors, and yet they adapted to the reality. And he realized also the terrible crimes that were committed against the Jews, and he decided to save as many Jews as possible.
Samuel recognizes the acts of Major Plagge to be heroic. Plagge designed the camp where he lived for about a year to prevent 1,000 Jewish families of the Vilna ghetto from being sent to an extermination camp. But as a complex time, the lines between hero and villain may fall more into a gray area of human nature, as fear, anger, and survival take over.
The German left the town, the Russian army arrived. I came out with my mother into the street. There was smoke, there were dead soldiers and so on. One of the first people we met was a woman that was crying with a little girl. And she was crying My mother didn't know by then that my father was dead. She learned it a few weeks later. But that woman knew already that her husband was dead. And my mother said, oh, the Germans. And so, no, she said, it's not the Germans who killed him. It was a Jewish woman. She says, it was Jewish partisans. Why? Why did the Jews kill a Jew? Because he was a policeman in the ghetto. And this thing for me was a kind of a shock. This, why? And I knew the man. He was a very nice man. I remember him. He was a policeman in the ghetto, but I remember him laughing with my father, telling jokes. He always kind of stroked my head. He sometimes played with me and so on.
History is a story of people, and Samuel and Elizabeth agree that by learning the terrible mistakes from the past, people in the present can prevent the errors and atrocities from happening to themselves.
Like I said, I couldn't believe it. I had to put the book down many times, and I said, I have to be ashamed. I'm German. That's what gets me. And I'm always very, very careful to say anything.
Today, I think the Germans are exactly like any other people. They could have been manipulated. The Germans were the very first to come to terms with their very painful story.
Elizabeth and Samuel were both thrust into a world torn apart by hatred and violence, but they each forged a future for themselves. Elizabeth married an American soldier and moved to the United States. Samuel traveled the world, mastering his craft and building his own family. Today, Generation Z is experiencing unprecedented challenges with advancements in technology, a more globalized world, and questions over the looming values and beliefs of the generations before.
I think in today's world, it's super easy on social media, like Instagram and TikTok or Facebook, just to find kind of like your echo chamber almost, just people and groups that really support your views, whether those are even extreme or kind of more mild. And then you kind of gain this almost false sense of everyone is kind of on your side and you have to fight against everyone who's not, which I think is just very divisive and not really something we want to work towards. I think we should kind of break out of those groups and those stereotypes and kind of, work together to eradicate them.
Scott Lickey is the executive director of the Institute for Holocaust Education. The IHE strives to educate the public about the Holocaust and provide opportunities for Holocaust survivors of their children to speak at schools. Their mission is to ensure that the events of the Holocaust are remembered accurately and, in turn, create a more equitable society.
And I take very seriously that my obligation to teach empathy, understanding, and to teach people to be an upstander. And then I'm very idealistic. I think if I can change one person, I've changed the world.
We need to be realistic of our abilities to enact change. It can be overwhelming, not knowing where to begin to make a difference. Sometimes all it takes is connecting with one person or expanding your inner circle, gaining new perspectives or outlooks. Any kind of positive change is powerful, no matter how small it is.
And despite a recent rise in anti-Semitic rhetoric, Omaha's Jewish community gathered pridefully.
Melodies written during the Holocaust, resurrected.
A community that views people of different faiths as friends and neighbors.
This is something that has really been crafted with care and compassion.
Out of love to all of these families.
Everyone should feel loved and everyone should feel important and like their needs are met.
Do something positive to those around you, and the effect will be felt across the world.
Although there is this theory that every 80 years history tends to repeat itself, I feel like we don't have to subscribe to that ideology and we don't have to feed into that kind of pessimistic view. I have a lot of hope for these younger generations and how much they're wanting to enact change, and I think overarchingly it's hard to really mentally prepare yourself for the amount of things that you want to change, and so to focus on the little things and to focus on the smaller changes where you can make them is so important, and that's what's going to prevent this, theory becoming true and kind of being reinforced.
History is at risk of repeating itself, but by hearing the stories of concerned parents, of kids wanting to protect their loved ones, of strangers sitting at a table together to share a meal, we can mold a more inclusive future. A future where we can learn from one another, a future where every number is a face.
The world is made like an oriental rug. When the weavers of oriental rugs make their rugs, they always create imperfections. There is never one design in an oriental rug that is exactly the copy of the same design next to it. Because the belief is that perfection is not human. That imperfection must be accepted. It is part of life.
Thank you.